Celsus's fundamental thesis is that there's an ancient divine wisdom known to the first human civilization, and that this ancient wisdom has been passed on through the ages, through sages in various ways, and through various cultures, but used most wisely by the Greeks, and that this wisdom is most accessible through Plato's philosophy. As Celsus put it, from the beginning, there is an ancient teaching, an archaios logos, or paleos logos, in which the wisest of nations, cities, and sages participated. They began from the same sort of doctrine, and so logically taught things similar in many respects. Then there was something like a cataclysm, whether natural, moral, or both, and the ancient wisdom was largely destroyed, but preserved through gossamer threads of tradition in various countries. This theory resembles modern notions such as that of Graham Hancock, who imagines an ancient super-civilization where the spiritual technology wiped out by a cataclysm in the last ice age, but transmitting its knowledge to give birth to great civilizations in Egypt, Turkey, and elsewhere. Although Hancock's theories today are called pseudoscience and pseudo-archaeology, in Celsus's day, the cultural myth of ancient wisdom, of an ancient civilization run by ancient sages, reigned supreme. This theory, or this grand narrative, began with Posidonius, who lived from about 135 to 51 before the Common Era. The theory was transmitted primarily through Stoic sources. Now, the works of Posidonius have themselves suffered a sort of cataclysm, but his ideas spread widely. Various Stoics, including Seneca and Cornutus, spoke of an archetypal wisdom held by primitive sages. The wisdom was largely lost as the nations spread out over the earth, but traces of it can be found in the most ancient customs, poetry, and mythography. Why did Celsus, a Platonist, adopt this fundamentally Stoic theory about the transmission of ancient knowledge? Well, philosophies aren't hermetically sealed, and Celsus was a broad and flexible thinker, so he included the best ideas from various streams of wisdom. In fact, the very idea of logos has a better Stoic than a Platonic pedigree. We need to also consider that in Celsus's time, unlike our own, the veneration of the ancient, or what is old, is much stronger, and it was easier to believe that human science and learning was not evolving, but rather devolving, under the influence of human vice and addiction to earthly pleasures. According to Celsus, the ancient cultures which retain traces of the ancient wisdom include the Egyptians, Assyrians, Indians, Persians, Odrysians, Samothracians, Eleusinians, Hyperboreans, the Galactophagi of Homer, the Druids of the Gauls, and the Getae. Now, Origen was bothered by the fact that the Jews were not included in this list, since evidently Numenius, another Middle Platonist, had included them. But one thing to keep in mind here is that Celsus didn't even include the Romans. This was not because Celsus hated the Romans, but probably because he viewed them as a late and derivative mixture of Italic peoples, culturally inferior to the Greeks, cobbling together Greek wisdom and imitating it. We can also add that, frankly, Celsus doesn't even include the Greeks as a whole in his list. He rather focuses on older tribes who inhabited what became Greek land, such as Eleusis and Samothrace. In these locations, ancient mysteries were still celebrated in Celsus's day, mysteries that were taken to be much older than the religious rites celebrated among the Hellenes. It was typically Alexandrian to reimagine the Jews as originally a group of Egyptians who broke away under the leadership of a disgraced Egyptian priest, namely Moses, and who later led this tribe to colonize southern Palestine. In holding this view, Celsus was not an anti-Semite. In fact, anti-Semitism, the racially inspired hatred of Jews, had not yet been invented. Celsus always spoke of cultural, not of racial, inferiority or superiority. So, for instance, Celsus believed that Egyptian animal cults are culturally inferior to the veneration of anthropomorphic cult statues among the Greeks, but Moses' aniconic worship of a single desert sprite, a god of chaos like Set, is a further degradation of Egyptian theology. An even further degradation is the irrational worship of a crucified Galilean man. And in this religious system, the truth has degraded so far that virtually no trace of the ancient wisdom remains. Now, according to Celsus, the true sages of old include Linus, Musaeus, Orpheus, Veracides, Zoroaster, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Hesiod, Homer, and finally Plato. Now, some ancient thinkers, namely Artapanus, wanted to identify Moses with Musaeus, said to be the teacher of Orpheus. Celsus did not share these views. After all, Musaeus was associated with Orpheus, who lived in the northern climes of Thrace, not with Egypt, in the south. Now, Plato is a kind of culmination of the ancient wisdom, not because he had any innovative ideas, but because he had a reconstruction and a sound reconstruction of the ancient wisdom. He was perhaps not a sage, but a philosopher, one seeking and loving wisdom. And he seems to have been the last philosopher to have really grasped the true teaching. Aristotle is never mentioned by Celsus, nor any of the later Platonists, such as Chrysippus or Polemo. The origin of Celsus's book title, The True Logos, may in fact be from Celsus's seventh letter, which Celsus quotes in 6.9. Even if this letter was not written by Plato, it's worth understanding and delving into it, for Celsus understood it as authentic, and he twice quoted from it. In the seventh letter, Plato describes his 3 Sicilian adventures. The first trip was for scientific exploration, but the latter 2 trips Plato made to help his friend Dion and to reform the Sicilian king Dionysius. In the seventh letter, Plato explains why his attempts at reforming the king failed, mostly due to Dionysius's non-philosophic and tyrannical nature. At one point, Plato mentions that Dionysius wrote a book in which he claimed to teach the higher doctrines of Plato. And Plato himself, though, makes clear that he only spoke with the king about such matters on a single occasion, and that he would never put his best doctrines in a book where it would be exposed and misused by ignorant readers, such as Dionysius himself. At this point, Plato speaks about a higher knowledge, which is not something that can be put into words like other sciences, but after long continued conversation between teacher and pupil in joint pursuit of a subject, suddenly like light flashing forth when a fire is kindled, it is born in the soul and straightway nourishes itself. Plato then proceeds to talk about his method, proper dialectic investigation of a topic. It's here that he uses this phrase, true logos, a logos that opposes anyone, such as King Dionysius, who presumes to write about these subjects. The content of this logos is apparently how to gain knowledge of an object. In short, one must know an object's name, its definition, and its perceptible form. All this empirical knowledge is the foundation for progressing in knowledge about the real essence of an object. Again, Celsus quotes this material in 6.9, where he contrasts Plato's method of patient dialectic with the Christian demand for immediate belief, because, putatively, Jesus came down from heaven. But Plato didn't make this claim. He never claimed to be divinely inspired. Rather, he invited rational inquiry through conversation, and he avoided non-falsifiable proclamations. True philosophy is characterized by this method of dialectic, not immediate belief. Now, dialectic is a somewhat fancy term. In simple speech, dialectic is the art of intelligent conversation. It doesn't immediately accept a statement as inspired, but reasons whether and how it could be inspired. Celsus, in fact, doesn't reject the reality of inspiration, and neither did Plato. He only denies that Jesus and other Christians were truly inspired. The Christian degradation of truth is in large part a misunderstanding and perversion of things that Plato had said. And Celsus helpfully gives a host of examples of this perversion, showing what he means. Christians, for instance, resort to emotional manipulation by music instead of reasoned argument in order to motivate their clientele. They, unlike the Egyptians, never make the transition from ephemeral matter to eternal ideas. Consequently, they reverence the flesh of Jesus, and we might add, of the martyrs, even though such flesh is much more corruptible than the gold, silver, and stone of the cult statues that they despise. The healings attributed to Jesus and to later Christians do not compare with the vivid healings of Asclepius, which enjoy multiple attestation in thousands upon thousands of votive gifts, some of which survive today. Unlike the mystery religions at Eleusis and Samothrace, for example, which have moral standards required for people to be initiated, Christians invite all the criminals and all the fools they can find. In fact, it's better to be a horrible sinner in Christian eyes because it ensures that one receives God's pity. But the very idea that God has pity was, for Celsus, a theological disaster, since the true God does not have any changeable emotions, and because it's unjust to favor pitiful people, no matter how loudly they wail in prayer. Celsus also searched Jewish scripture to find evidence of degradation. The Jewish and Christian myth of the Great Flood, he said, is a misunderstanding of more ancient versions. Now, apart from Celsus's value judgment about perversion, we do know today that it's true that flood myths were prevalent in ancient Mesopotamia, and that the myth of Genesis probably does derive from more primitive Mesopotamian flood stories. Celsus did not know these more ancient Mesopotamian myths from Babylon, etc., but he did know Hellenic mythology, such as the myth of Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, who were saved from a giant flood and then repopulated the earth. The Tower of Babel story, Celsus said, is a corruption of another Greek tale, the story of Otis and Ephialtes, two sibling giants who piled up great mountains in order to assault the gods in heaven. Philo of Alexandria made the same connection between Babel and these giants, though he reversed the direction of dependence. In turn, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a debasement of the Phaethon myth, said Celsus, which spoke of cities burned when the sun drew close to earth. And Jews and Christians debased this myth by applying it only to 5 local cities in southern Palestine. The story of Adam made from earth in Genesis 2:7 is derived from other myths of autochthony, namely the idea that nations such as the Athenians and the Arcadians sprung from ancestors who were born literally from their native soil. And Celsus remarks the Athenians and Arcadians had evidence of this, but Jews and Christians, by contrast, had only the mere assertion of myth. And Celsus also turns to the Gospels and Paul to find degradation in distinctly Christian scriptures. And again, he presents multiple examples. For instance, Paul's insistence that most wisdom of the world is base was taken over from Greek sages like Heraclitus and Socrates, who said that there was a difference between divine and human wisdom. Christian teaching on humility corrupts a saying of Plato's Laws. The eye of a needle statement spoken by Jesus condemns the rich for not having the correct desires, and Plato makes the same point in a superior language in his Laws 743a to quote, "I'll never concede that the rich man can become really happy without being virtuous as well. To be extremely virtuous and exceptionally rich at the same time is out of the question." Likewise, the transcendent deity of the Christians, higher than the heavens, is a misunderstanding of Plato's Phaedrus 247c. Quote, "What is in the superheavenly place is without color, without shape, without solidity, a being that really is what it is, the subject of all true knowledge, visible only to higher consciousness, and the soul's steersman." Likewise, Jesus' stance on non-retaliation is fundamentally Socratic, taken from Plato's Crito 49b to e, and the Ophite understanding of multiple heavens and initiations is a degradation of Mithraic lore and mysteries. The Christian idea of Satan, moreover, that great rebel in heaven, misunderstands more ancient myths from Pherecydes, who spoke of an ancient war in heaven. The Christian reference to Jesus as Son of God corrupts the Hermetic teaching of the cosmos as God's child. And the Christian understanding of resurrection, finally, degrades the more ancient Platonic and Pythagorean wisdom of transmigration. What are we to make of these comparisons? The comparative technique that Celsus uses might seem somewhat naive to us, since it posits a simplistic genetic connection between ideas. Historically speaking, Jesus probably did not read Plato, and Paul did not read Heraclitus or Socrates. The myths of Genesis derive from Mesopotamia, not from Greece. Ideas do widely diffuse, of course, but the actual lines of transmission between ideas are much more complex and hard to discern than Celsus makes out. They are like rays of light that bend and refract 1,000 times before they even appear in surviving literature, and most ancient literature has been lost. Still, the comparisons that Celsus made, if combined with a better theory of cultural transmission and the transformation of knowledge, can serve as springboards to more sophisticated comparisons. At the very least, Celsus's comparisons show us what in ancient Platonists considered to be similar and different between early Christian and Platonic ideas, and they remind us that Christian ideas emerged in dynamic cultural interaction with the many and complex webs of ideas in the Hellenistic world. In the end, was Celsus right about there being a monolithic ancient wisdom preserved by the sages in an ancient culture? Probably not, in my view. But even if he was right, it wouldn't matter too much. After all, the antiquity of an idea is not really a measure of its truth. Ideas evolve and change in 1,000 different ways. Celsus does, however, helpfully highlight the derivative and innovative nature of Christianity. As a religion, Christianity is very much a latecomer in the vast history of human evolution, which is well over 100,000 years. Saying that Christianity is derivative is not an insult. The creative ideas of all religions all derive from somewhere, and we can still admire their creativity and power. This is the normal process of human cognition. We are ever comparing, borrowing, tweaking, and representing ideas all the time. And in every generation, this process continues as human knowledge both progresses and regresses in various ways and at various times.